Dear friends, welcome to my channel. This is Taras BEREZOVETS with you. So, the latest round of talks in Istanbul, which according to general opinion ended unsuccessfully, were used by Moscow solely to buy time, as well as to push for direct dialogue between dictator Putin and the American President Donald Trump. In the end, we see that the Kremlin has partially achieved its goals. Donald Trump, as he himself announced, will call Putin at the Kremlin on Monday at 10 in the morning. That will be 5 p.m. Kiev time. And during this phone conversation, Trump himself plans, as he wrote on the social network Truth Social, to discuss ending the bloodshed, which is causing, on average, more than 5,000 Russian and Ukrainian soldiers to die each week, as well as trade issues. This last part, and trade issues. A very interesting slip, although not exactly a slip. That's a kind of follow-up. There's such an expression in English. In addition, Trump announced that after negotiations with Putin, he would have a conversation with Zelensky. And then a third conversation. Together with Zelensky, he plans to speak with unnamed representatives of NATO countries. Well, as we can assume, this is of course about Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and the President of France, Emmanuel Macron. Most likely, it will also include the Prime Minister of Poland, Tusk, and the Federal Chancellor of Germany, Friedrich Merz. And in conclusion, Trump wrote, "I hope this will be a productive day. We will achieve a ceasefire and this extremely brutal war, which should never have started, will finally end. May God bless us all." Yes, especially Putin, one might add, especially in the context of today's enthronement ceremony of the new Pope Leo XVIII, which I will talk about a bit later. Putin's press secretary Peskov promptly confirmed that yes, indeed, a conversation between Trump and Putin is scheduled for May 19th. Earlier, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio discussed preparations for this very phone conversation with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov over the phone. In the official, rather dry statement from the State Department, it is reported that Rubio called for an immediate ceasefire and welcomed the agreement reached on the exchange of prisoners of war between Kyiv and Moscow. The State Department also reports that Rubio conveyed a strong message from Trump, reaffirming the United States' commitment to achieving a comprehensive peace agreement. The best way forward is outlined in the broad peace plan proposed by the United States, according to the official statement from the US State Department. Rubio also wrote on the social network X that we have presented a strong peace plan. Let's not miss this crucial opportunity. It is time to put an end to this war. Later, speaking on the American television channel CBS News, Rubio also stated that a meeting between Trump and Putin is not planned in the near future. Now, this is interesting. Not planned, meaning there will be a phone call, but no meeting. And there is also no direct preparation for it underway. Neither the date nor the location of a possible meeting is being discussed. As they say, surprise, surprise. This contradicts a recent statement by Donald Trump himself, in which he said he intended to meet with Putin in the very near future, though he did not specify when. Sources in the White House reported that this meeting could even take place before the end of May. And now Rubio is denying everything. Neither the location nor the timing is being discussed. Rubio stated that serious efforts are necessary for this meeting to take place. So far, he is not aware, and I quote, of any such efforts on the part of the United States. We, Rubio said, have made a proposal, and the president did so publicly. The logistics of organizing such a meeting will require some work. Therefore, I cannot say that at this moment it is being planned at the level of choosing a location and date. But the president wants to do this. He wants to do it as soon as possible. He also confirmed that the Kremlin has expressed its readiness, I quote, for a meeting between the leaders of the two countries, but it has not yet been determined where it will take place or what it will be about. Now that's interesting, what it will be about. Rubio also emphasized that Trump demanded a 30-day ceasefire in order for all of this to happen. In other words, in response to the Russian ultimatum voiced by Medinsky, the Americans put forward their previous conditions. So it turns out to be quite an interesting scheme. Mine, yours, I don't understand. Moscow keeps droning on about how they should be given 4 regions, or else they'll take a 5th or a 6th. And in general, let's go back to the Istanbul agreements. Do a kind of reboot, return to 2002, back to the future, or forward to the past. But Washington doesn't hear any of this, saying, no, let's have a 30-day ceasefire, and after that we'll move forward. But in principle, Washington is acting correctly, considering that Putin has chosen such a hard-line position of blackmail. He should be dealt with using exactly the same methods. What is troubling in this situation? What is troubling, first and foremost, is the blackmail that the Kremlin used during these negotiations. Let me remind you, there was a scandalous situation that was reported by the Economist journalist Oliver Carroll. He is a British correspondent who has, well, practically lived in Ukraine for probably the last 20 years. I've known him for a very long time, and he knows the ins and outs of Ukrainian affairs. He is practically fluent in both Russian and Ukrainian. He is someone who understands everything happening in Ukraine very deeply. So Oliver Carroll wrote a short post on the social network X, although at first it wasn't clear who he was talking about. Later it became clear that he was talking about Medinsky, that Medinsky, as he wrote with reference to a source in the Ukrainian delegation, essentially behaved like a thug at the negotiating table in Istanbul. He stated that there were members of the delegation at the table who had already lost their loved ones. If you don't end the war, you will lose more. And soon it became clear whom this Kremlin creature, there's no other word for it, was talking about. And he addressed these words to the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, the former permanent representative of Ukraine to the UN, Sergei Kizlytsya, a highly respected Ukrainian diplomat who himself wrote about it on the social network X, tagging the economist Oliver Carroll. Kizlytsya wrote that his nephew, who fought in the Air Assault Forces unit, died in 2022. His young nephew, the son of his own sister, in 2022. And he said that attempts to intimidate us will ultimately lead to nothing. So, knowing that Serhiy Kislych's own nephew died in the war, a young, successful guy who had his whole life ahead of him and gave his life at the front, this creature, Medinsky, who himself never served a single day in the army, this ridiculous armchair warrior, let me remind you, is best remembered for his quote about the 25th chromosome. He claimed that Russians have an extra 25th chromosome that sets them apart from everyone else. This so-called expert, this so-called doctor of science is a fraud. At the same time, as is well known, the 25th chromosome is a marker for people with Down syndrome. So not only did he insult people suffering from this syndrome by comparing them to Russians, but in fact he also called Russians mentally ill. Well, this is just to give you an idea of what kind of doctor of science he is. I'll say it again. This armchair warrior who, sitting at his desk, brazenly and cynically threatened and blackmailed members of the Ukrainian delegation. Well, obviously Mr. Medinsky clearly wants a scooter to come visit him. That's it. Those who are in the know understand what this is about. So, Donald Trump also commented on the outcome of these negotiations, and he did so in his own characteristic manner, once again criticizing not Putin, of course, but Zelensky, because Zelensky refuses to accommodate the Kremlin's negotiating position. But where is he supposed to go? Is he supposed to give up 4 regions that the Russian occupying army doesn't even control? Well, that's certainly an interesting logic. But nevertheless, as they say, things aren't so clear-cut. It's not all that bleak since we're seeing other signals. Well, first of all, there's Rubio, who firmly stated his position on the 30-day ceasefire during his conversation with Lavrov. And he dismissed all those ideas about give us the 4 regions we don't control. But there are also a number of positive signals, including some unexpected ones. In particular, Trump's special envoy for the Middle East, who is now also involved in resolving the Russia-Ukraine war, Steve Witkoff, was planning to travel to meet with Putin for negotiations for the 5th time next week. However, according to the well-informed British publication The Financial Times, citing 3 sources familiar with the situation, Witkoff has cancelled his visit to Moscow. The decision was made after it became clear that Putin was not going to discuss the peace plan that Stephen Witkoff had put together, prepared in collaboration with other members of the administration, in particular former Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg and Secretary of State, and at the same time National Security Advisor Marco Rubio. This plan was prepared in coordination with the Ukrainian side. In particular, the head of the Ukrainian President's Office, Andriy Yermak, and Defense Minister Rustem Umerov participated in drafting this plan, according to the Financial Times. The plan, consisting of 22 points, was prepared by a group of American officials whom Trump entrusted with resolving the Ukrainian issue. In particular, as Witkoff previously stated, the Ukrainians are ready to give up the territory occupied by the Russians, but not de jure forever, rather de facto, because the Russians have effectively occupied this land. In other words, it is an acknowledgement of the situation on the ground. However, Putin rejected this plan, which was prepared by Steve Witkoff, someone they had already praised as much as possible, with Kirill Dmitriev even singing his praises, practically fawning over him to the point of indecency, as they say. But even Steve Witkoff turned out to be too much of a hawk for the Kremlin. Now Putin has rejected this plan. As a result, Witkoff did not fly to Moscow. And I'll repeat once again, this is positive news, especially considering that Medinsky was threatening to seize 2 more Ukrainian regions, Sumy and Kharkiv, as reported by the Financial Times and The Economist, if Moscow's ultimatum, which had been voiced, was not accepted. At the same time, Putin declares that they cannot grant the Ukrainians any 30-day ceasefire because they would dig shelters, produce more drones, and Russia would end up losing even more troops. Well, in this case, Putin is in fact in that rare situation where he obviously did not lie. But the fact remains, Moscow overplayed its hand with its blackmail, and the Americans responded. First, there was Rubio's statement. Second, the cancellation of Witkoff's visit. And finally, the third and most important, which is the practical military aspect. The Americans sent the world's largest serially produced unmanned aerial vehicle, the RQ-4B Global Hawk, from the NATO Navy airbase Sigonella in Sicily to conduct reconnaissance over occupied Crimea. This happened for the first time since June 2024. In other words, for 11 months, the Americans did not use this largest drone, this enormous UAV. It really is worth taking a moment to talk about this remarkable capability. This aircraft is capable of staying in the air for an impressive duration of up to 36 hours at a time, all without needing to land or refuel even once. So, this very largest drone, with a wingspan of nearly 40 meters, is equipped with high-tech surveillance equipment, radars with synthetic aperture technology, optoelectronic infrared sensors, and is capable of collecting real-time information about air defense activities, the movement of military aircraft, ships, and all of that. The Global Hawk took off the day before, I'll repeat once again, from the Sigonella base in Sicily and conducted reconnaissance at a distance of about 120 kilometers from the Crimean coast for the first time since June 2024. Back then, it was also launched from Sicily, but from the Catania air base, that's in the eastern part of Sicily. Well, and this is the most serious, I believe, absolutely concrete military signal, one that it would probably have been hard to expect from the Trump administration, but nevertheless, it has happened. This is a clear argument from the Americans, who understand that you can negotiate with the Kremlin, but you need to act with force. And most importantly, this launch took place on the eve of Monday. In other words, Trump, already knowing that he would be speaking with Putin, sent a very clear signal. We are ready to resume. This is not just a single Global Hawk drone. Essentially, this is a signal that the Americans can return both in terms of increasing their intelligence activities regarding the occupied Ukrainian regions, as well as ramping up American military assistance. How did Putin respond to this? The most massive single drone attack of the entire war was carried out against Ukrainian regions. The Kyiv, Donetsk, and Dnipropetrovsk regions suffered the most. A total of 273 drones were launched, of which 128 were so-called decoys, imitation devices. 88 were shot down, and the remaining drones either crashed somewhere in open fields or reached their targets. It is reported that most of the strikes occurred in the Kyiv region and in the city of Kyiv. The air raid alert lasted for a total of about 9 hours. In the Obukiv district of the Kyiv region, a 28-year-old local woman was killed. 3 people, a 4-year-old child, a 61-year-old woman, and a 59-year-old man, were injured. Also in the Fastiv district, a medical center with an area of 5,000 square meters and a warehouse of 500 square meters were destroyed. Information about the victims is being clarified. Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk regions were also affected, I remind you. Here, fortunately, there were no deaths or injuries. Before this, the most massive attack was carried out by the enemy on February 23, 2025. At that time, they used 267 drones, this time 273. So essentially, it's clear. This is telling. On the eve of the negotiations, the Americans deliberately flexed their muscles for the Kremlin, and the Kremlin, unfortunately, showed that it does not intend to reduce the number of shellings or strikes right now, primarily targeting civilian infrastructure. Almost all of this was directed at civilian infrastructure, not military targets. This is the same policy of terror that the Kremlin consciously chose for itself back in 2020. And nothing is changing. Another extremely important event took place today in Italy, or more precisely in the Vatican. Here, the enthronement, or rather the inauguration, well, it's called the enthronement of Pope Leo XIV took place. Let me remind you, this is the first Pope from North America, which, without a doubt, Donald Trump is absolutely thrilled about. Today, Pope Leo XIV celebrated Mass at St. Peter's Basilica, received the Fisherman's Ring and the Woolen Pallium. Also at the inauguration, which was attended by about 150,000 faithful, were, among others, the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, both of whom are, as is well known, Catholics, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, Their Majesties King Felipe VI of Spain and King Philippe of Belgium, respectively, and numerous world leaders. From Russia, Minister of Culture Olga Lyubimova was supposed to attend the ceremony, but she did not arrive due to an unapproved flight route. In other words, she was not granted an air corridor. Therefore, Russia was represented by its ambassador to the Vatican, Ivan Soltanovsky. It has been reported that Pope Leo XV will hold his first meeting after the enthronement. So whom will he meet with? Surprise, surprise, with the President of Ukraine. Yes, with the President of Ukraine. And only tomorrow will he receive U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance on Monday. The Pope, this first meeting with a foreign leader will be today, when he receives Zelensky. Pope Leo XIV immediately stated that he is taking the most active stance possible in bringing the Russian-Ukrainian war to an end. The Vatican has officially called the outcome of the negotiations in Istanbul tragic, and Pope Leo immediately declared that he is ready to receive both sides at the Vatican in order to put an end to Russia's war against Ukraine. And not to criticize his predecessor, Leo XIV, but this Pope apparently is cut from a different cloth. As stated by the Pope's representative, Parolin, the Pope plans to offer the Vatican the Holy See as a venue for a direct meeting between the two sides. In other words, this is a direct proposal for negotiations between Zelensky and Putin. The Pontiff stated that the Holy See is always ready to help bring enemies face to face. See how he calls them? Unlike the American president, he calls them directly enemies. Let's meet and talk. Those who make history are peacemakers. But it is absolutely clear that the Pope, who is now the new Pope, is an American, has enormous influence not only in the Catholic world, but also with the new American administration. J.D. Vance is a Catholic, I remind you. Marco Rubio is a Catholic. Two key members of Donald Trump's cabinet. Donald Trump himself, however, is not. But for him, the influence of the Catholic community is decisive. There is a huge number of Catholics, both English-speaking and Spanish-speaking. This is without a doubt a vast number of voters, and they support the Republicans and Donald Trump. Therefore, for Donald Trump, of course, any, let's say, conflict or tension in relations with the American Pope would be absolutely unacceptable right now. This is a great opportunity for the Vatican at the moment. I think he is using it to push through these negotiations now and finally find a solution to the war. By the way, tomorrow, perhaps after Pope Leo XIV speaks with J.D. Vance, it's possible that Trump himself will then speak with the Russian dictator. And finally, one more piece of good news. Of course, here without any quotation marks. In Kolomna near Moscow, during a domestic dispute, Vladimir Nedoshivin, the developer of the Iskander operational tactical missile system, was killed. He was 74 years old. Yes, he was already retired, but nevertheless, he was the developer of that very system. The Telegram channel VCHKOGPU, which was recently banned on Telegram, by the way, but apparently they've reincarnated somewhere else, reported that the developer of the Iskander, designer Nedoshivin, was found in serious condition in the entranceway of a building on 2nd Yubileyny Proyezd on Victory Day, May 9th. Sources claim that the fatal injuries to the pensioner were inflicted by his neighbor, a 32-year-old plumber. This plumber killed the Iskander designer, Anatoly Kolobaitsev. He stated that he pushed Nedoshivin down the stairs after the latter relieved himself in the entranceway. In simpler terms, he urinated. Everything about this news is remarkable. Nedoshivin abused alcohol. It is reported that after he invented the Iskander, the Russian authorities completely forgot about him. Forgotten, abandoned. And so, in fact, this is a rather symbolic, emblematic end for a man who developed a weapon of mass murder, primarily against Ukrainians, but not only them. A logical outcome, a death at the hands of the plumber Kolobaitsev. It seems to me this is a fitting conclusion. And it wouldn't be bad if in the same way the life of the Russian dictator and the traitor Vladimir Medinsky ended at the hands of another plumber. What do you think? Friends, leave your opinions in the comments. Take care of yourselves. Subscribe to the channel. Glory to Ukraine. Glory to the armed forces. Glory to Ukrainian special forces. Glory to Ukrainian territorial defense forces. Friends, this was Major Taras Belzovets of the Ukrainian army with you. See you next time. Bye-bye.